The Senate Judiciary Committee held a hearing on the rising rate of religious hate crimes in the United States. The Justice Department's special counsel for religious discrimination testified along with the Arlington, Texas police chief. This is 2.5 hours.
Welcome, everybody, to a very important hearing that we have. Thank you for being patient while we get started here. I'll have an opening statement. Senator Feinstein will, and then I'll introduce our first panel, and then when we're done there, go to the second panel and introduce that at that time. The Senate Judiciary Committee today is holding a hearing that we entitle Responses to the Increase in Religious Hate Crimes. This is a subject of great bipartisan interest in the committee. Religious hate crimes harm victims and also have a great impact on communities. Many of these crimes would never have been committed but for hatred. They run counter to America's values such as religious freedom and tolerance. Americans have the right to be safe against those who would treat them as members of religious groups rather than as individuals. Religious hate crimes are on the rise. Crimes against Jewish people are the most common religious hate crimes, and they have increased. Religious hate crimes against Muslims are the fastest growing category. These crimes increased by 67% between 2014 and 2015, the last year in which the FBI has records available. I have been contacted by fearful Iowans. Fear for practicing one's religion should never happen in this country. This problem has been growing for some time and is not new. Last week, President Trump stated, quote, "This is my pledge to you. We will confront anti-Semitism. We will stamp out prejudice. We will condemn hatred. We will bear witness, and we will act," end of quote. With these statements, the president followed a tradition for government action dating back to George Washington, who in 1790 wrote to a synagogue in Rhode Island that, quote, "The government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanctions, to persecution no assistance," end of quote. Government action to enforce the First Amendment guarantee of free exercise of religion is necessary if these rights are to be protected against those who commit these awful hate crimes. Law enforcement resources will need to be deployed to houses of worship if necessary. Law enforcement may need to create specific task forces and provide special assistance to religious groups to enhance security or for other purposes. That reality may require people who read the First Amendment Establishment Clause so broadly as to prohibit any government assistance that aids a religious entity to reconsider those views. So I have this for instance. The Supreme Court recently considered the constitutionality of a Missouri state constitutional provision prohibiting government financial assistance to religious institutions and whether the state could prohibit a religious institution from receiving government grants in a program that would be available to secular entities. At oral arguments, Justice Alito asked the lawyer from Missouri about a grant program such an existing federal program to enhance, to quote, "harden nonprofit organization facilities that are deemed to be at high risk for terrorist attacks." Continuing to quote, "So if you have a synagogue that is at high risk of an attack by an anti-Semitic group or a mosque that is considered to be at high risk for attack by an anti-Muslim group, would the Missouri Constitution permit the erection of bollards like we have around the court here," end of quote, from Alito. Astonishing to me, the lawyer responded, no. The Missouri Constitution would not permit the state, even on a neutral basis, to administer a security grant program to protect houses of worship. The safety of buildings is important in itself, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that people are so often in those buildings and being targeted. The Establishment Clause should not be read to forbid government from saving the lives of people practicing their religion. I believe that religious hate crimes require a governmental response. Our response is financial assistance to facilities that are targeted. I hope that the Supreme Court does not issue a ruling that allows government to forbid religious entities from receiving assistance against attacks that is available to other organizations. Our witnesses today will shed light on this topic. We will hear from the Justice Department about efforts underway to combat religious hate crimes. We will then hear from civil rights and law enforcement organizations on the nature of the problems and how to address it. We will also hear from a victim of religious hate crime. I look forward to their testimony. Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for calling this hearing. I think it's a very important topic, and I think it goes to one of our core values as a country, and that's religious freedom and tolerance. We pride ourselves on being a unique and diverse society, which means we've got to accept many differences, different creeds, different colors, different ethnicities. And that's important to the concept of America, to be a united country that respects these differences. And into this creeps this suspicion and creeps hate. So the topic today is religious hate crimes. And I think it doesn't matter if it's a hate crime based on one's religion, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, or any other element of our shared values and humanity as a country. We've got to condemn every form of it, no matter who is targeted. And I believe that to the depth of my being. I'm hopeful that this committee can begin and continue to work on this, even if we focus on one part of it, which is religious hate today. While the federal government has an important role to play in helping state and local governments address hate crimes, I want to make clear that change needs, in my view, to take place on the local level. Each community faces its own unique challenge when it comes to racial and religious bias. And I think back as my time in local government for some 18 years, 9 as a county supervisor and 9 as a mayor. And I remember when swastikas were painted on synagogues, and I got on the phone, I called the chief of police, I said, you go down there, you look at it, you have your people do something about it, and I made a strong public statement that this was not going to be tolerated in my city. Same thing happened with other kinds of crimes designated at people because of who they are, their religion, their race, their, whether they're straight or gay. So my view is it's very important to address it. It's very important to say we're not going to allow it. And it's very important for leaders not to shrink from this, but to lead in it. And so in a sense, this is a start. And I think everybody on this dais understands and wants to really create a different society that does not countenance this kind of hate. According to the Anti-Defamation League, there have been reports of 541 anti-Semitic incidents in the first 4 months of this year. That's an increase of 86% compared to the number of incidents recorded over the same period the year before. there have been 380 harassment incidents, 161 bomb threats. That's an increase of 127% over 2016. Bomb threats were called into more than 80 Jewish community centers and children's day schools located in 33 states and 2 Canadian provinces. One day, February 27th of this year, there were 31 threats called into 23 Jewish community centers and 8 Jewish day schools. That's 31 bomb threats in a single day. These crimes sparked tremendous fear, and thankfully, the Justice Department has arrested the men responsible, and no one was injured or killed. Hate crimes against Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim have also increased at an alarming rate. And these crimes include horrific murders. I'd like to draw your attention to a map which shows recent incidents of anti-Muslim hate crimes tracked by Muslim Advocates, an organization that's a leader on this topic. And you can see where they are concentrated. And I find that very interesting as well. It counts 254 separate incidents since November the 15th to the present. In 2016 alone, the Southern Poverty Law Center also found the number of anti-Muslim hate groups tripled in 2016, going from 34 in 2015 to 101 Muslim hate groups last year. Similarly, the FBI's hate crimes data also captures this sharp increase during that same period. In my home state of California, according to researchers from Cal State San Bernardino, hate crimes against American Muslims increased 78% in 2015. Attacks on perceived Muslims also rose sharply. So what can be done? First, it's incumbent, as I said, on all leaders to loudly condemn these crimes. That includes race as well as religion. In my view, the rise in hate crimes is due in part to the perception that people in positions of power are indifferent to what's happening, don't prioritize the protection of the rights of all Americans, and don't speak out. So we've got to stand together, and we have to make clear that hate has no place in our country, and these crimes will be investigated, and the seriousness will be taken into consideration in the sentencing. Second, we need to ensure that communities and law enforcement have the support and resources they need to prevent and investigate these crimes. Where state and local agencies and victims need federal support, the Justice Department needs to provide it. And third, the federal government must improve the reporting of hate crimes. And reporting's key because it increases awareness and accountability, but it's inadequate today. So if we don't have an accurate picture of what's happening, it's much harder for Justice and FBI to address the problem. The Hate Crime Statistics Act of 1990 required the FBI to collect hate crimes data and develop reporting guidelines for state and local law enforcement. Now, the quality of that data has improved over time. The Justice Department revised its incident report to collect data on hate crimes against Sikh, Hindu, Arab, Buddhist, Mormon, Jehovah's Witness, and Orthodox Christian individuals. 26 of us requested that change, but we can and must do better. Many states and local jurisdictions still don't report hate crimes to the FBI. While the FBI typically reports 5,000 to 10,000 hate crimes, the true number, it's said, may approach 300,000, which is 30 times the FBI estimation. Senator Hatch and I just introduced a bill to update the Church Arson Prevention Act of 1996 to prevent the intentional making of threats to religious property. Now that's a big deal. If someone goes to another's church and defaces it, or puts a bomb there, or writes threatening graffiti on it, it has an impact on a wide range of people. And so it has to be taken very seriously. Let me end by quoting Nobel laureate and Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel. Sometimes we must interfere. When human lives are endangered, when human dignity is in jeopardy, national borders and sensitivities become irrelevant. Whenever men or women are persecuted because of their race, religion, or political views, that place must at that moment become the center of the universe. So with that before us, Chairman Grassley, I want to thank you very much for working with us and for also holding this hearing. Thank you.
It's nice of you. Thank you. I will now introduce our first witness, Eric Treen. He is Special Counsel for Religious Discrimination in the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. He has an undergraduate degree from Amherst College and a law degree from Harvard. I recognize you for 5 minutes, but if you have a longer statement to put in the record, and I never cut anybody off at just the exact 5 minutes, but when that happens, kind of summarize the rest of your statement. Thank you. Go ahead, Eric.
Yes, thank you, and good morning, Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Feinstein, and respected members of the committee. I want to thank you for holding this hearing this morning to discuss the important topic of enforcing federal hate crime laws with a focus on religious-based hate crimes. I'm sorry that Acting Assistant Attorney General Tom Wheeler cannot be here today due to a family emergency. The Attorney General has made fighting violent crime one of his top priorities. Hate crimes are a serious problem that the Attorney General believes must be part of our national effort to reduce violent crime. This is the case for two basic reasons. First, hate crimes make up about 4% of violent crime in America. It's thus part of the picture of violent crime in our country. Second, these are crimes that are meant to intimidate and terrorize communities. We're all concerned about ourselves or our families becoming victims of crimes, but when people are targeted for hate crimes, they experience something on top of this. They experience the concern that they'll be attacked because they stand out in some way, because of their race, their religion, or their national origin. President Trump, in his first address to Congress, spoke about the threats against Jewish community centers around the country, as well as the shooting of 2 Indian men in Kansas City, one fatally. He stated, "We are a country that stands united in condemning hate and evil in all its forms." Attorney General Sessions has stressed the importance of combating hate crimes against people of all religious backgrounds. While race-based hate crimes remain the largest category of hate crimes, religion-based hate crimes are the second largest. And there's some concerning trends. The FBI Uniform Crime Report data show a 23% rise in religious hate crimes from 2014 to 15, including a 67% rise in anti-Muslim hate crime and a 9% rise in anti-Jewish hate crimes. The Department of Justice is committed to aggressively prosecuting these cases. On April 21st, we charged a man arrested in Israel with making threats to Jewish community centers in the U.S. We obtained the conviction of a Tennessee man on February 16th for soliciting another man to help him burn down a mosque in the small hamlet of Islamburg, New York. And on January 10th, the department obtained the death penalty against Dylan Roof for the murder of 9 African-American worshipers at a Bible study at Emmanuel AME Church in Charleston, South Carolina. My written testimony details the various federal hate crime laws that we can use in these situations. And these are powerful laws that enable us to bring federal resources to bear to support our state and local law enforcement partners and ensure that serious crimes have serious consequences. Congress has also provided us with strong resources for fighting hate crimes. With arsons of houses of worship, for example, we're able to bring in the resources of the ATF and the FBI to find and pursue the perpetrators. And we do think we have good processes in place for working with our state and local law enforcement partners in an efficient and effective manner. But we can always get better, and we must do better in reducing these deplorable hate crimes. That's why the Attorney General has made the Hate Crime Subcommittee of his Violent Crimes Task Force one of the pillars of this effort. In the third week of June, the Violent Crime Task Force will hold a summit on violent crime. The following week, on June 29th, the Hate Crime Subcommittee will hold an additional one-day summit focusing solely on identifying, prosecuting, and preventing hate crimes. The summit will allow DOJ officials to discuss with experts, community groups, and state and local law enforcement partners how to best reduce the incidence of hate crime in America. The summit and the subcommittee are also focused on the problem of incomplete hate crime data. We know that the UCR data undercount hate crimes, and we need to do better. This will be part of the conversation at the summit and with the subcommittee going forward. We can fully address the problem of hate crimes only when we fully understand it. The subcommittee and the summit will also work on ways to improve training and outreach. Many members of minority communities, due to language or cultural barriers, are reluctant to come forward when they are victims of hate crimes. Outreach is critical to the success of any program to combat hate crimes. Since he joined the Civil Rights Division 3 months ago, Acting Assistant Attorney General Tom Wheeler and I have met with Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, Hindu, and Christian organizations and can attest to the importance of communications. For us, as the government, to hear what's going on and what we can do better, and to let the community know the areas where we need help from them, such as helping to ensure that hate crimes are reported. I thank you for the dialogue you're facilitating here today, and I look forward to your questions.
We'll have 5-minute rounds. I think you covered my first question some, but because it's the summit is so important in the work of the department and a major effort of the Attorney General Sessions, I guess I'd ask you to elaborate further, if you want to, on what the department's plans are for the summit and the Hate Crime Subcommittee.
Yes, thank you, Senator. The idea is to not just bring our expertise from the components of DOJ working on this, from FBI, Civil Rights Division, U.S. Attorney's offices, Community Relations Service, but also to bring in diverse communities, religious communities, racial communities, communities representing the LGBT persons, and hear about really the totality of the problem, things that we're doing well, things we're not doing well, things with data collection, what we can do to make that better. I know Director Comey has testified about the long-term plan to migrate to a national incident-based reporting system, but also what we can do in the several years before that program is fully implemented. So there's lots to do. I don't want to say it's just a listening session because we have some ideas going in, but we really want to hear from experts, from local law enforcement, from communities about what we should be doing.
Okay. My second question is asking you for examples of religious hate crime investigations and prosecutions that the new administration's pursuing. Some of those could probably be carried over from the previous administration. Maybe you don't have to, I don't expect you to give us a long list now. You can supplement it with what you tell us now with some written material if you want to.
Sure, those are outlined in the written testimony. I just highlight a few. I know we have 2 senators here from Minnesota. On March 8th, a judge sentenced in a case that we brought a Minnesota man to 12 months in prison for a threat to blow up a mosque. Bakersfield, California, Senator Feinstein's state, April 10th, we obtained a 15-year sentence for a man who fired a shotgun towards a Latino family, then went down the street and fired his shotgun at a Middle Eastern man's convenience store. I mentioned this when we're talking about religious hate crimes because one thing we found is the people who hate aren't terribly discriminating in their victims. If someone is angry at Muslims, they'll attack Sikhs, Middle Easterners, people who look different. So that we always look at those as a general problem that we need to address holistically. We've had a case in February 8th. We have received guilty pleas from a man who threatened 2 grocery store owners in Orlando, Florida, who were Muslim. And he told them they had 30 days to close their stores or be attacked. That's the kind of violence that we're aimed at, where people are not only attacking people because of their race, but attacking them for exercising their civil rights to have a job, to start a business, to move into the neighborhood of their choice. The hate crimes laws protect those underlying civil rights of people to live freely in our society.
My last question deals with the fact that you've been a DOJ lawyer in religious freedom cases for many years. The most recent statistics on religious hate crimes that we will hear about today date from, I think, 2014 and 2015. And is it your experience that religious hate crime instances have been on the rise for quite a few years now, not just since the presidential election? Were there failures to combat religious hate crimes at the Justice Department that you witnessed in previous administrations?
Well, Your Honor, fighting hate, Senator, I'm more used to being in court, Senator. Hate crimes are a perpetual problem in societies. Hatred is nothing new to our society or unique to America, and so it's a problem we've been battling for many years. We have seen a trend in the FBI data that we have 2014 to 15, we saw a rise. The year before that, like in anti-Muslim crime, we saw a more modest rise. We don't have the data since then. I can say that we have many referrals that are coming in from community groups, from U.S. attorneys' offices, and we're taking this problem very seriously. We are throwing our resources at it, and the Attorney General believes this is a major part of his anti-crime initiative, and we will continue to aggressively pursue hate crimes.
Senator Feinstein.
One of the things that I'm bothered by is that the statistics don't really give the right situation, it seems to me. Hate crimes, for example, the FBI typically reports 7,000 to 10,000 hate crimes. Bureau of Justice statistics estimate the true number may approach 300,000, which is 30 times the FBI estimation. The percentage of religiously motivated hate crimes nearly tripled between 2004 and 2012. How do you account for these discrepancies?
Senator, they're based on 2 different methodologies, and I agree that the FBI data undercounts, but we have to remember the FBI data is counting actual instances. So each of those instances is one where a police officer in the field has received a reported case, maybe prosecuting it, maybe not, but is coding that in the data system as a hate crime. So it's an actual crime that the police have been involved in. We know that some states are better than others in reporting. We're getting better at that. We're training every year about 1,400 new police departments locally. We're expecting about 1,400 more trainings, agencies trained this year. So those are actual cases. When you look at the Bureau of Justice statistics, that's done by a polling methodology. So
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yes, ma'am.
How many cities don't report at all?
There are some states that don't report at all, and there are a number of cities. I don't have the exact number.
See, that might be a good thing to take a look at, because if I'm right and the local leader makes a difference in all of this, staying quiet and doing nothing isn't helpful.
Yes, Senator. One thing we did last year in the summer, and we expect to do again, is to reach out to our 94 U.S. attorneys and giving them we gave them a list of what cities in their district are not reporting hate crimes, and get them in their normal interactions with other law enforcement officials and mayors to say, is this something that you can help us with? So we have reach with those 94 U.S. attorneys.
Tell us who is on the hate crime subcommittee of the task force on crime re-education and re-education and public safety. Who is on this, and what is that committee supposed to accomplish?
Well, I can say generally it's chaired by Tom Wheeler, the Acting Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. It has on it representatives from the FBI Hate Crimes Unit, other components of FBI, Community Relations Service, a wide range.
It's all government.
It's all DOJ. Again, it's DOJ coming together and talking about what barriers we have, and then going out at the summit to hear from the community, from experts and so forth.
Well, maybe that's a good place to start, to really try to see if this can't be infused nationally with local people who are there, who know their populations, who when they stand up, hopefully people listen, as opposed to some remote source in the federal bureaucracy. So, I mean, that's what I would hope that this committee would take a look at doing, and that is involving local leaders and encourage them to take a position. I have found that where local leaders step up and we're not going to tolerate this, it does make a difference.
Senator, I think that's a very good idea, and I will take that back to the department leadership.
Thanks. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Senator Hack.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing today. Religious liberty and the protection of the right of people to believe the way they want to and exercise religion are some of the nation's foundational and fundamental principles. That said, I'm troubled by some of the recent reports of increases in religious hate crimes, not only in the United States, but also throughout the world. Some of the recent examples include the more than 100 bomb threats made at Jewish community centers throughout this country, as well as the vandalism of Jewish cemeteries in St. Louis, Philadelphia, and other cities. In response to these and other religiously motivated hate crimes, the President addressed this issue during a joint session of Congress when he said, quote, "We may be a nation divided on policies, but we are a country that stands united in condemning hate and evil in all of its very ugly forms," unquote. The Vice President also denounced these acts of religious intolerance when he said there is no place in America for hatred or acts of prejudice or violence or anti-Semitism. As someone whose own pioneer ancestors were persecuted and driven from their homes, forced to settle down in the rugged Mountain West because of their Mormon beliefs, I agree that America must not tolerate religiously motivated hate crimes, or any hate crimes for that matter. Yesterday, I was joined by my friend, the ranking member, in introducing the Protecting Religiously Affiliated Institutions Act. I want to thank Senator Feinstein for joining me in authoring this bill, which would expand the Church Arson Prevention Act to criminalize the threats made to intentionally deface, damage, or destroy any religious property, or to threaten, to obstruct by force or threat of force the enjoyment of a person's free exercise of their religious beliefs. I hope that in the coming weeks, the Senate will consider and pass this legislation as a demonstration of our commitment to be united against evil and hate. And with that, I just have a few questions. Let me, Mr. Train, ask you this. Can you please share what the department is doing to promote religious liberty of all people in this country?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. One of the things that we are at the Civil Rights Division focused on now is aggressive enforcement of the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. It's a law that you sponsored with Senator Kennedy in the Senate, and has done a great deal to expand religious liberty of all people. One of the things we've seen in recent years, since 2010, is a rise in the number of anti-Muslim cases under RLUIPA. So cases where someone opposes a Muslim school or a mosque. Those make up about 37% of our RLUIPA investigations, whereas Muslims make up, 1 to 2% of the population. We have right now one case that we resolved in March and 3 that are ongoing involving mosques. We have these involving many different communities of faith and their ability to construct places of worship. And we continue to aggressively pursue these cases.
Well, many are concerned that crime statistics in this country are not accurate because many jurisdictions do not fully participate in reporting those activities or those crimes. So I'm very concerned about that too. Now, is this an accurate assessment? And what can be done to improve the accuracy of hate crime statistics in the United States?
No, it is true. The hate crime reporting relies on voluntary compliance by state and local governments. We have 14,000 agencies participating in the program. There are some that do not, as we discussed a moment ago. One goal is to get more involved, and also those who are already involved give better training for officers to spot hate crimes, to know what to look for, how to record it so it gets captured in the data.
There seems to be targeting of police officers by virtue of the fact that they are police officers. What is the department doing to combat this troubling trend as well?
Get it answered.
The Attorney General has made fighting violent crime one of his very highest priorities, and certainly protecting our men and women who are out there in the field, putting their lives on the line to protect us and face violence is an important part of that violent crime picture. And on March 31st, the Attorney General issued a letter regarding public safety and law enforcement and talked about issues such as protecting police officer safety, boosting morale, and also a number of other things, including protecting the civil rights of all Americans.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you.
Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and Senator Feinstein, thank you for holding this important hearing. Senator Coons and I actually both spoke at the National Prayer Breakfast this year, and I did the closing prayer, and I used a poem from Walt Whitman in which he said, "I hear America singing the varied carols I hear." And in the poem, he talks about shoemakers and masons and carpenters and all of the various jobs Americans hold. But I said that day we were talking about the varied religions, and we had a rabbi on the stage. We obviously had a big contingent of Christians there, and we had an imam in the front row. And I think it is very important that we're having this hearing to remind ourselves that this is what America has been built on, the freedom of religion. And I want to ask you, first of all, being from a state that has the largest Somali population in the country, as you've acknowledged, we had a recent attack on a mosque. We've had attacks on African-American homes. We, like many states, had threats against our Jewish community centers. I just met with that community. But we're also a state of these refugees, of Somalis, Liberians, Hmong, Oromos. And what I would like to know, as we've seen this rash of these threats and actual violent acts, from your perspective at the Justice Department, what do you see as the cause of this increase in threats?
Thank you, Senator. You're mentioning the Somali population in Minnesota. We handled a couple years ago, and I was involved personally in a case involving a Somali Muslim community that wanted to rent out I'm going to say purchase
yes, I'm aware of
building.
that case, and the U.S. Attorney, Andy Lugar, and you worked on that and was
yes.
very good. But could you just tell me quickly, because I want to get 2 or 3 more questions, what do you see as the cause?
Okay, I don't know.
Well, I just wanted to say, at the end of that case,
No,
there's a photo of a mayor embracing the Somali imam, and I think that just sort of shows the the breaking down of those barriers of misunderstanding. If you look at polling data, people...
Yes, but what do you see as the cause? Why are we suddenly seeing an increase? Because the people are the same that we had 10 years ago, pretty much, so the people in our country.
Right, what I was going to say is that one of the leading causes of anti-Muslim bias is not knowing a Muslim. So people who are more likely to have a friend who's Muslim or know someone are less likely to have the bias.
But why the increase in the last few years when we had the Muslims in Minnesota before that, and now we're suddenly seeing this number of threats against them and our Jewish community?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a sociologist. I can say that, we are concerned by trends. When we see something like a 67% rise in anti-Muslim hate crimes, we take action, and we are bringing cases to try to meet this problem.
Well, let me just tell you some of my views, having been in the prosecutor after 9/11 and seeing when President Bush stood up and said this isn't about one religion, going around with our Republican-appointed U.S. attorney, and we didn't see a rash of hate crimes. We had one or two in my jurisdiction because of that. And so I think the language at the top matters. And I recently heard the story of a Muslim family that had been there, the parents, at 9/11. They had been through that in Minnesota and had experienced no bad language or threats. And now here they are with their kids 10 years or so more later, and they're at a restaurant, and some guy walks by and says, "You four go home. You go home to where you came from." And the little girl looks up at her mom and says, "Mom, I don't want to go home. You said we could eat out tonight." And you think of the words of that innocent child. She didn't even know what he was talking about, because Minnesota is the only home she knows. The United States is the only home that she knows. So my point is, first of all, language matters. And I appreciate the work the Justice Department has done, but I hope you pass this on to those are the highest officials of our government. People in the last years, months who've been saying Muslims shouldn't even be able to run for president, when that's the girl of dream. Maybe that won't happen in our lifetime, but that is the dream of every child in this country, that they should be able to run for president if they're a citizen of this country. So I think those words matter. I also think we have some additional funding we're trying to get for Homeland Security for faith-based community centers, and I know that's out of Homeland Security, but I hope you'll look at that and talk to the Attorney General about that. And then the third thing is some of the work that we've been doing in Minnesota and other places is targeting extremism. And I guess I'd end with that of, what you think we should be doing more. There's some grants that have gone out, and what's the Justice Department's views of trying to do more to root this out at its cause.
Well, I would just respond when you mentioned Homeland Security and helping with communities of faith. One of the things we do at the Civil Rights Division in our outreach is hold joint meetings, joint conference calls with community leaders. And one of the things that they have to offer for communities is protective security advisors, PSAs. They do walkthroughs into any kind of critical infrastructure, but that includes places of worship, religious schools, other schools, and point out vulnerabilities to arson, to active shooter, other security issues. And so that's something very positive that's going on, that we are making a point of talking to the community about. Next week, we're sponsoring, co-sponsoring with FEMA, a church arson. It's an Arson Awareness Week focusing on house of worship arson, and to heighten awareness of these issues and for communities to take advantage of those federal resources that are out there for them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much.
Senator Kennedy, you're next, but if you aren't ready, Senator Lee is ready.
I was going to defer to Senator Lee. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Senator Kennedy. I really appreciate it. Sir, what can you tell us about what the department's doing to reach out to vulnerable communities?
And then I got the public safety.
Yeah. One of the things the Civil Rights Division has traditionally done, and Acting Assistant Attorney General Tom Wheeler has made a special commitment to, is to reach out to communities. We have a quarterly meeting with Muslim, Arab, Sikh, South Asian, and Hindu organizations where we bring in Homeland Security, Department of Transportation, Civil Rights Division talk about the range of issues, not just hate crimes, though that's a major part of it, but all the different issues of discrimination that's facing that particular community based on the backlash that started after 9/11 and has continued to the present. We also do outreach to many communities of faith, as well as many different civil rights organizations.
Thank you. Now, I know you can't comment on pending investigations, but can you confirm that you do have investigations that are ongoing and possibly some pending prosecutions?
Yeah, yes, we do. We have a number of investigations into anti-religious hate crimes of various sorts, and we also have an ongoing investigation into the JCC threats. We made an arrest the Israelis made an arrest of a man we identified, and after some real heavy work by the FBI, and they really ran this one to the ground. And the man's been charged in federal court in Florida, in Georgia, but the investigation continues.
To your knowledge, sir, has the administration changed any of its policies with regard to investigating and prosecuting hate crimes since the beginning of its administration?
No, the Attorney General has been consistent and strong in his message that hate crime is violent crime, and we need to do everything we can with all the tools in our prosecutorial toolbox to fight this problem.
Okay. And then it's my understanding that the Attorney General established this hate crimes subcommittee. Is that something that existed before?
No, it's a new subcommittee that's part of his task force on crime reduction and public safety. So that's his sort of premier initiative, and then he made a hate crime subcommittee a principal part of that initiative.
And is part of the work of that subcommittee looking at whether there's been an increase, whether we're experiencing an increase in hate crimes?
They are looking at the data question. They are looking also at processes. Do we have all the tools we need? Are there reforms that we should recommend as a department? Are there things we should do internally differently in how we work with U.S. attorneys' offices, how we work with state and local law enforcement? Really, everything's on the table to try to improve how we're addressing the hate crime problem.
I would imagine that when looking at something like that and trying to figure out where the trend is, it's got to be frustrating to realize that anytime you're looking at the data, you're already a year at least removed from the data. And that's got to make it difficult to track that. Is there anything Congress can do to help you with that?
Yeah, the data conversation is really part of an ongoing conversation. I know Director Comey's testified about it, and there are long-term plans for migrating to a new data system. There are short-term solutions that should be explored. But yes, I mean, having good data helps us allocate our resources. But that said, we know now that we have a hate crime problem and a religious hate crime problem, regardless, and we don't need to wait for the data to know that, and we are putting resources into combating that. But having better data does allow us to do that more effectively and efficiently.
Well, thank you, and thank you for your work on this issue. We live in a country that is an island oasis of religious freedom in many respects, and yet notwithstanding that status, we're not free from the type of bigotry that has caused so much suffering in so many parts of the world. And we want to make sure that our law enforcement personnel have the tools they need to combat violence, combat bigotry as they see it. And we thank you for your service.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member for this important hearing. Mr. Treen, thank you for joining us today, especially on such short notice. You begin your written testimony by underscoring efforts the Trump administration has made to address hate crimes and your oral testimony. In addition to Justice Department investigations into hate crimes and other potentially bias-motivated incidents, you point out that President Trump condemned hate during his first address to Congress, and that last week he, quote, reasserted his resolve to, unquote, to confront hate crimes at an event here in the Capitol. Now, these are all important steps, and the President should be commended for clearly and unequivocally condemning hate. But far too often, whether through missteps or associations with controversial figures, the White House fails to speak clearly in opposition to bias and hate. Far too often, the White House sends mixed messages. Mr. Treen, as we attempt to understand the factors contributing to the rise in hate, violence, and rhetoric, I'm curious what message you think it sends to individuals who may engage in that kind of reprehensible behavior when the President selects Steve Bannon as his chief strategist. Steve Bannon, after all, is the former chairman of Breitbart News, and under his leadership, the site regularly trafficked in an ideology of racism, misogyny, xenophobia, homophobia, anti-Muslim propaganda, and anti-Semitism. What message does Mr. Bannon's presence send, Mr. Treen?
Senator, the message that I feel strongest as a prosecutor and an attorney for the Department of Justice is the consistent message that I've gotten from the Attorney General to pursue hate crimes, to continue doing the work we've been doing.
I'm not saying the message that you got. I'm saying because you're not committing any of the religious hate crimes. I'm talking about the people who do. What message does it send to them, not you, that Mr. Bannon is a chief strategist?
Right. No, I would say I was encouraged, as you were, by the President's remarks before Congress.
That's not answering my question.
Yeah, I can only really speak for myself, and I have consistently been given the message to continue to pursue cases on behalf of Muslims.
You are the special counsel for religious discrimination. Certainly you must have some perspective on this that you can share with us on what it means when the President selects as a special counsel someone who's trafficked in anti-Muslim propaganda.
Senator, with all due respect, I am here talking about hate crimes and can only stress that I've had a consistent message that we should continue to pursue these mosque cases involving under RLUIPA and these hate crime cases regardless of the religion of the victim.
I understand that. I'm asking you a question. What does it, listen, the President came to Minnesota the Sunday before the election. It was his first public appearance there. And he told the people gathered at our airport, an airport where about 1,000 Somalis work, that Minnesota suffered enough because of the Somali refugees that were there. What kind of message does that send to these people who desecrate mosques, who attack people who are Muslim or they think are Muslim? What kind of message does that send to them?
Senator, I'll just say with all respect that in my role, I am concerned with sending out a message that we will enforce the law for all persons, that regardless of somebody's nationality, their religion, that the Department of Justice stands ready to protect their rights.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Treen, I grew up in a segregated country. Some would say the segregated South, and of course the South was segregated, but so was our country. Because it's been my experience that racism and bigotry doesn't understand geographical lines. And I know we still have problems in this country, as Senator Franken talked about. But it seems to me, I mean, it struck me listening to your testimony, we're here talking about hate crimes. That's something that not that many years ago in America we wouldn't be talking about. And I think that's a good thing. And again, while we have a lot of problems in our country in terms of the way we stereotype people, I'm pretty proud of what's happened in this country. I mean, in 150 years, we've gone from institutionalized slavery, to give one example, to a president of the United States who happens to be African American. And in the grand scheme of things, 150 years is not that very long. Having said that, we still have work to do. I understand that. But I want to be sure I understand our terms. Tell me your definition of a hate crime.
Yeah, the term hate crime can be a little misleading because there are many kinds of crimes that are caused by hate, right?
And don't filibuster me. I've only got 3.5 minutes. Okay.
All I'm saying is hate crime, there are a lot of crimes motivated by hatred, neighbor versus neighbor over something, and those are serious crimes. But we've also recognized there's a category, I think bias crime is probably a better term, but hate crime has caught on both domestically and internationally.
Is it based on status or an illegitimate status?
It's based on a particular status that the legislature has decided is in need of particular protection.
Like race?
Race, religion,
gender,
sexual orientation, and so forth, yes.
Okay, I get it. A lot of hate crimes are committed well, all hate crimes are committed, at least in America, in a state or a county or parish, but they're prosecuted by local officials. What's the Justice Department doing to assist them and make sure they take it seriously?
Right, there are hate crime statutes in 45 states. Yep. But those that do have them cover some of the...
Which 5 don't have them?
I don't know that offhand,
okay.
Senator. There's overlap with ours in the others, but it's not perfect. So there will sometimes be crimes where there's a gap in coverage in a state. Our prosecutors work with state and local law enforcement to determine, you know, is this better for them to proceed, better for us to proceed? It's a cooperative endeavor. I mean, sometimes regular crimes, if someone's murdered, someone's facing capital murder, we don't need to step in. It doesn't need to be a hate crime. But sometimes you might have arson of a place of worship, and the arson laws will only give a couple years, whereas we could bring a prosecution and get 15 years for burning down a church or a mosque. So we work cooperatively with the state and locals on these issues.
What kind of hate crimes nationwide do we see the most of? Obviously, I would assume race, but...
Race is number 1.
What's number 2?
Then religion.
Religion? Okay. And which particular religion? Jewish religion?
Jewish religion.
What?
Yeah, the FBI statistics was about 650 in 2015, and then I think it was 260 some anti-Muslim hate. So Jewish number 1, and then Muslim number 2, both representing relatively small portions of our population, which is a particular concern.
All right. Does Mr. Bannon work at the Department of Justice?
No, sir.
Okay. Does the Attorney General have any jurisdiction over the White House and the White House staff?
No, Senator.
Okay. Is there any doubt in your mind, any doubt whatsoever, that in your opinion, the Attorney General of the United States intends to pursue hate crimes vigorously?
He has consistently given us the encouragement to pursue these cases vigorously. Yes, yes.
Is there any doubt in your mind?
No.
None?
No, sir.
0?
No, Senator.
Nada?
No, yes, Senator.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
there's some disagreement. If she's next, let me know, because I'm going by a list that there is disagreement. Hirono. Hirono, Coons, Blumenthal, White House. Okay. Proceed, Senator from.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's no accident that there is a rise in hate crimes, because we're in an environment where the president targets Muslims with his language. And of course, during World War II, and there was a tremendous anti-Japanese fervor leading to the internment of 120,000 Japanese Americans. And during the height of the fears about the importing of Japanese cars, Vincent Chen was murdered. And here's where the federal government does play a role, because while the murderers were prosecuted at the state level, they were acquitted. It took the federal government to pursue these murderers. So after a most divisive campaign, we are in an environment where some people think it's okay to express their racism through not just words, but through overt threats. So I know that we acknowledge, and you acknowledge, that there's a rise in hate crimes and that there's underreporting. So I just wanted to ask you, last week, the Department of Homeland Security launched the Victims of Immigration Crime Engagement Office, or VOICE. So on the one hand, we have an administration who purports to focus on hate crimes, yet the VOICE office puts immigrants at risk by releasing personally identifiable information, and not necessarily accurate information, and information about children also. How can we be assured that we are not demonizing immigrants, many of whom are actually victims of hate crimes, when you have an office like this where people are encouraged to provide information about immigrant crimes committed by immigrants? Your thoughts?
Yes, Senator, thank you. At the Civil Rights Division, we frequently interact with the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at DHS. I don't know about the office that you raised, but one of the things we do, as I mentioned earlier, we have these quarterly meetings with Masa communities, Muslim, Arab, Sikh, South Asian, and Hindu communities, and CRCL from DHS is a part of that, and communities raise issues like the one that you've raised, and this is something that we can discuss with Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Office and pursue, but I currently don't have any particular information about the VOICE office.
I would ask that you pay some attention to whatever was the reason for the VOICE office and what's coming out of it, and any endangerment of people. And in fact, if the information that's released through VOICE is inaccurate, I would say that the federal government is subject to some litigation. Going on to, I realize the Civil Rights Division has created a subcommittee on hate crimes that is embedded in a larger task force targeting illegal immigrants and drug trafficking. I'm concerned that the hate crimes subcommittee is under a larger task force that is focused on immigration enforcement. Can you assure us that the hate crimes subcommittee is given sufficient priority within the Civil Rights Division?
Yes, Senator. The overall task force is the Task Force on Crime Reduction and Public Safety. And in recognition of the fact that the Attorney General believes that hate crime is a violent crime problem that's part of the violent crime problem in America, he has put one of the key subcommittees there as a hate crime subcommittee that's headed by the head of the Civil Rights Division. And so it has a great deal of autonomy, but it's also part of that broader effort, sort of that marquee effort to combat all forms of violent crime in the U.S.
Well, actually, it's in a larger task force targeting illegal immigrants, and it's very clear that this administration is targeting, is not a fan of immigration. So I would hate for this subcommittee to become subsumed by the fervor of focusing on illegal immigration. So please assure me that that is not going to happen.
Yeah, to my understanding, the task force, the overarching task force, is focused on all forms of violent crime, and that is its focus. And hate crimes are a part of that picture. I don't have any indication that it is focused on
So is your
immigration.
subcommittee, I'm running out of time, is your subcommittee going to issue your own reports and also since education, racism is learned. And so I'd be really interested to know how your subcommittee will focus on starting early through educational efforts, because prosecution is one thing, and I don't know how much of a deterrent prosecution is, albeit very important, but really hatred is learned. So I'd like to know what kind of focus you're putting on the prevention side through education.
No, I agree with that, and in the Civil Rights Division, we put a lot of focus into ensuring equal educational opportunity and that students are able to be educated free of harassment on protected bases.
Well, I'll have further questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr.
Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Treen, thank you for being here. I think some has been said about some of the advisors the President has brought in. But I think in the Department of Justice, we can go back to 2009 and see an Attorney General, then Senator, who was a ranking member, who had a concern with the uptick in hate crimes and prompted a discussion and ultimately a hearing on it. And it sounds like to me you're not getting anything but keep your foot on the accelerator in terms of pursuing hate crime prosecutions?
No, that is correct, Senator.
The task force, you mentioned 45 states have implemented some legislation. In looking at how you can work more closely with state, local, or tribal governments, are there any particularly, I think, forward-leaning states in terms of how well they've done it at the state level? And the reason I ask that question is to get more leverage in terms of just judicial capacity, to be able to prosecute, have the resources.
Yeah, I'm a little reluctant to put out several states for fear of leaving out others who are doing a good job. But I was talking just yesterday with one of our senior prosecutors about New York, and he said, I just can't remember the last time that we, after looking at a hate crime, thought, well, we need to come in because they were doing such a fantastic job. So kudos to them, but they're kudos to others, and I don't want to leave others out by listing several.
How are your resources going? Are you properly resourced for the caseload that you're dealing with?
Yeah, I mean, I would hold back on answering that because I know we're coming up on budget time. I know we're able to do a lot of great work. Every agency will say we could use more, but I'll leave that to the departmental folks who are making requests on behalf of the whole department.
What about other devices or authorities that we should consider at the federal level to give you more tools for prosecution?
Yeah, the summit we'll have in June will look at legislative proposals. There are any number that...
See any that are generally accepted as things you would like to see?
I don't want to jump the gun and discuss what I think is good when we haven't had the time. We're creating a space for communities and local prosecutors, FBI, civil rights to come together and work through this, and I don't want to get ahead of that.
Yeah. One thing in the task force that I would really encourage you to look at, I was in the state of North Carolina legislature for a few years, and making sure that data collection is very important. We need more information to be more instructed in how we pursue these kinds of crimes and identify trends. But there can also be heavy-handed data collection, which creates a distraction for people in law enforcement and the courts, and then there can be right-sized data collection. I hope you've got the right minds on the task force looking at that, if that should come forth as a recommendation.
Right, that's why we want to make sure we include state and local law enforcement in this discussion. They're the ones who are going to be facing the burden of data collection at the user end.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Before I call on Senator Coons, Senator Leahy and Durbin weren't able to come here, so they've asked if I could put a statement in the record form, so without objection, that will happen now. Senator Coons.
Thank you very much, Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Feinstein. Thank you, Mr. Treen, for your testimony here today. As you've heard from my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, we are deeply concerned about the rise in hate crimes targeting religious minority faiths in the United States and their steady rise. In Delaware, I've been alarmed to see our Jewish community targeted with multiple bomb threats and to see our Muslim American neighbors and friends fearful as a result of the toxic rhetoric and instances of violence around the country. And you, sir, have testified that there's been a noticeable uptick in violent crimes, hate crimes against Muslims and those who are perceived to be Muslim. In my home state, we've had a period of positive rallies promoting tolerance at our JCC, at our main mosque, at our General Assembly. But citizens from my state are asking for a clear, unified message from federal law enforcement and from our federal government. And you and the administration have gotten that message. 100 senators joined a letter back in March calling for DOJ, DHS, FBI to take swift response to widespread bomb threats against JCCs. And I'll just submit for the record, it's pretty rare that 100 of us agree on anything. And in April, Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Feinstein led a letter to Attorney General Sessions saying that the DOJ needs to directly address this steadily increasing number of religiously motivated hate crimes. So, Mr. Treen, I've got two questions for you. First would be, how do you establish priorities when there are so many different groups that are feeling unsafe, they feel threatened, they feel that the proportion of threats against them as a percentage of the population, as you suggest in your testimony, is steadily going up? And how do we pursue prosecution, and how do we change the temperature? And my second question, frankly, follows up on what Senator Franken asked. I am encouraged by your statement that you've gotten a consistent message from Attorney General Sessions to keep prosecuting hate crimes. But this is in response to a significant deficit created in the course of the campaign, where all suggest that then-candidate Trump, in rally after rally, and Senator Franken cited one that happened in Minnesota, made statements about a Muslim ban, about immigrants, about those of minority faiths that I think led to an inflaming of passions in an unconstructive way. And I do think that the continued presence of Steve Bannon as one of his most senior advisors continues to send mixed messages. So while I'm encouraged, sir, that you say the Attorney General has sent a consistent message, that's good. I am concerned that there is a mixed message being sent to our country, that President Trump last week at the Yom HaShoah event made positive, appropriate statements about combating religiously motivated hatred and violence. But there is a lot of work to do to overcome an accumulated deficit, a message that was spread far and wide during the campaign and that Steve Bannon's presence in the White House continues to reinforce that is a mixed message. How do you set priorities, sir? And how do you set those priorities in a way that deals with this deficit of confidence among some religious minorities in this country who feel that they were targeted in the course of the campaign?
Yes, thank you, Senator. On the question of priorities, we want to be able to ensure that every hate crime that occurs in the United States is punished, is the perpetrators caught, and they're punished with a just punishment. And that's something that the federal government alone cannot do. But we have 94 U.S. attorneys working with state and local law enforcement. And it's a very complex, our system of government is very complex, but it's a complex system of working with state and locals, finding in given cases if maybe we don't think they're pursuing it strongly enough, and then stepping in and having a tough discussion, or more often having a give and take about who should be prosecuting this case. It's complex, but we're a country with 50 different states and a web of federalist laws, so that's how we do it. But it's something that we think we can do better, and that's part of the purpose of this task force and the summit we're having in June. On the question of messaging, one of the things we always try to do is we send a message in our actions on our prosecuting a case. Tom Wheeler's been very strong in his press statements and the U.S. Attorney's press statements in these hate crimes, especially the Muslim hate crimes, saying that an attack on one faith is an attack on our fundamental principles, and that we as Americans cannot stand as one group is attacked. And I think that messaging is very important, coming from the Civil Rights Division and coming from the Attorney General and the whole Justice Department.
Well, thank you, sir. At some point, I expect this administration will advance a nominee to head the Civil Rights Division. And I am hopeful that this committee will send a unified message that we expect the prosecution of hate crimes, particularly against religious minorities, particularly against those where there has been a steady uptick in both hate speech and hate crimes against them, will be high in his or her priorities.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. Welcome, Mr. Treen. Thanks for your testimony. Your job is to fight hatred and bias based on race, religion, or ethnicity, correct?
Yes, as well as hate crimes based on sexual orientation.
And you were a law clerk for a very distinguished federal judge, were you not? John Walker.
Yes, Senator.
So does it concern you that the President of the United States denounced a federal judge based on his ethnicity?
You know, Senator, I'm here representing the department on hate crimes, and I just don't think it's appropriate for me to speak about that.
Really? A federal judge denounced based on ethnicity, and you have no comment?
Well, you know, I'm here to discuss the issue of religious intolerance and hate crimes, and don't believe it's appropriate to go far afield into many other areas that might be out there.
Well, I recognize that we can't extract an answer from you here, but I'm surprised that you do not have a concern about a denunciation by the President of the United States of a federal judge based on his ethnicity. And I hope you'll reconsider and perhaps submit something further in writing. Because culture and leadership are important in this area. And I want to just tell you a story that I think illustrates the importance of leadership. Hate crimes are insidious because they harm not only the victim, but also the community. And in Meriden, Connecticut, we had an incident that deeply divided our community and created tremendous contention when one of the mosque neighbors in Meriden shot the building and was then charged under federal hate crimes laws by the United States Attorney for Connecticut. Instead of this man being condemned to incarceration, instead, he was assigned at the advocacy of the mosque itself to do community service. And in fact, he performed community service at the mosque and tried to bring together the entire community. His example of community service at the mosque was the result of the leaders of the Muslim community in Meriden advocating to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the court that incarceration would have a less constructive effect than that kind of community service. So I have submitted a bill, it's called the No Hate Act, that would permit and encourage judges to recommend community service and education as an additional sentence for people convicted under hate crime laws. I visited the mosque. In fact, I observed the individual who fired these shots through the press at the mosque, and I think I may have met him there, and heard leaders of the mosque describe their personal experience. The kind of awareness and education and cultural contribution made by this kind of statute, I think, could be substantial. Would you agree?
Very much so, Your Honor. I mean, Senator, and I would just mention that in my work, I've interacted with many Muslim communities around the country and heard stories like what you've just told. One in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where one of the chief opponents of a mosque there went into an emergency room with a heart problem. And lo and behold, the cardiologist who was brought in to help her was one of the board members of the mosque. And after he treated her with great respect, even knowing who she was, and he left, she started crying and told the ER doctor, that she just didn't know. She just didn't know that this is who that he could be like this. And so it's that ignorance that we need to overcome.
Well, I agree, and Senator Hirono made a reference to the importance of culture and learning and so forth. There's a great song in a musical called South Pacific about prejudice. It has to be carefully taught. And I think unteaching that kind of bias and prejudice is something all of us have to do. And in fact, I am among 13 senators. 12 of my colleagues have joined in this effort, including Senators Durbin, Klobuchar, Hirono, in a letter calling for the White House to establish a presidential task force on hate crimes. Would you think that's a good idea?
That's certainly something that I will take back to Acting Assistant Attorney General Wheeler and the subcommittee as one possible recommendation they could make.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
By the way, calling Senator Blumenthal Your Honor is not a bad thing. I think he's argued more cases in front of the United States Supreme Court than any living senator, so don't worry about that. I appreciate your commitment to making sure that hate crimes get prosecuted, and I want to echo the view I think you've heard loud and clear from all my colleagues that it's a bit disconcerting to have an administration that so often telegraphs enthusiasm for division and for discrimination, while at the same time you're being asked to prosecute fully and fairly where these cases turn up. If that's not a message you've received from this hearing, let me say that it should be. One can't just wait around for a hate crime to take place and then prosecute it, as you well know. It is also very important that proper investigation be done into organizations that promise or threaten hate crimes. There are neo-Nazi groups in this country. There are white supremacist groups in this country. There are so-called militia groups in this country that create a significant risk of violence and even terrorism. And a lot of what they would do in the way of criminal activity, I think, would be safely described as a hate crime, given the motivations that bring those groups together. Could you tell me a little bit on the investigative side? Obviously, we can't go into details, but are you satisfied that efforts to monitor, infiltrate, get warnings of violent behavior from, and in other ways put the law enforcement spotlight onto these groups is adequate?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Certainly, organized hate groups are a significant problem in the U.S. It's one that particularly affects the Jewish community. I think if we look at anti-Semitic crimes are disproportionately committed by organized groups as opposed to individuals who just go off on their own. If you look at our cases, I really am reluctant to talk about investigative techniques, except to the extent that in cases like the Robert Daugert case that I mentioned earlier in the testimony, which was a man from Tennessee who was reaching out to others on the internet to plot this attack on a mosque and community in Islamburg, New York, a very small community formed by African-American Muslim converts in upstate New York. And there, the FBI, using confidential informants, was able to infiltrate and obtain the information we needed to prove at trial and have him convicted on 4 counts. So it is certainly a tool in the FBI's toolbox.
Do you see that as an episodic effort that occurred because somebody bumped across information that caused the investigation to emerge? Or are you comfortable that the FBI has a systemic and systematic effort to infiltrate and gather intelligence on white supremacist militia-type groups that threaten violence to American citizens?
Yeah. At the Civil Rights Division, we're on the prosecutorial end, so we work with the FBI as our investigators. I would largely defer to FBI to testify
my question
on those
is,
issues.
are you satisfied from what you see?
Yes. Yes, I am.
That the FBI has an adequately systematic effort to infiltrate, gather evidence and intelligence about potential violence from such organizations?
Yes, in the cases that I have worked on, that has been my experience.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I know it's a long series of questions you had, but it's very important to have the administration's and your department's view on it. I thank you very much, and you're dismissed.
Thank you.
Would the next panel come as I introduce you? Our second panel has 4 witnesses. Jonathan Greenblatt, CEO and National Director, Anti-Defamation League. Prior to that, served as Special Assistant to President Obama. Mr. Greenblatt has an undergraduate degree from Tufts University. Next is Dr. Prabhjot Singh. Dr. Singh is Director of the Arnold Institute of Global Health at Mount Sinai Hospital, where he's also an attending physician. PhD degree from Rockefeller University and MD from Cornell. Third witness, Vanita Gupta. On June the 1st, she became President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Prior to that, she served as Acting Assistant Attorney General at Justice's Civil Rights Division. She has her undergraduate degree from Yale and law from New York University. Chief Will Johnson is our final witness. Chief Johnson is the Chief of Police for Arlington Police Department, Arlington, Texas. He's testifying on behalf of the International Association of Chiefs of Police. He's a graduate of the FBI National Academy, has an undergraduate degree from Texas Tech, master's degree from TCU. We'll go in the way that I introduced you, so Mr. Greenblatt, would you please proceed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Feinstein, and members of the committee. On behalf of the Anti-Defamation League, let me first say thank you for your leadership in recognizing the importance of addressing the troubling increase in religious hate crimes. I also want to acknowledge that it's really a pleasure to share this table with my esteemed colleagues. Since 1913, the ADL's mission has been to, quote, stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all. For us, this is a dual and interlocking mission. When fair treatment is secured for all, our democracy is strengthened, and that is good for its Jews and other minorities. And when Jews and other minorities can live safely and securely in this country, that is good for our democracy. You have my full testimony, but allow me to highlight a few salient points. First, the ADL has been polling on anti-Semitic attitudes in the United States since 1964. The good news is that a large majority of Americans do not subscribe to anti-Semitic stereotypes. But while attitudes are down, As the chairman noted in his opening comments, actual anti-Semitic incidences are up. Last year, there was a 34% increase, including acts of harassment, vandalism, and violence. Alarmingly, in just the first 3 months of this year, the total jumped to 86%. Moreover, there were nearly as many incidences of anti-Semitic bullying and vandalism at K-12 schools in the last quarter as took place in all of 2016. We see this as a deeply unsettling pattern about the messages our children are getting and acting upon. Second, as the ranking member noted, we have insufficient data relative to the size of this growing problem. Even the FBI's information is incomplete, but it still reported crimes in 2015 against Jews up 9%, and as the chairman noted, crimes against Muslims up 67%. In fact, last year, religion-based crimes were the highest proportion of hate crimes in the 25-year history of the Hate Crime Statistics Act. It's actually shocking to us that last year, 87 major U.S. population centers either improbably told the FBI that they had zero hate crimes or didn't provide any information at all. Next, we need to deal with cyber hate. Now, more often than not, racists and anti-Semites, including the so-called alt-right, are exploiting the internet to spread their hatred and harass Jews and other minorities. This became very apparent in the last presidential campaign when Jewish journalists frequently were terrorized on Twitter. Last year, we found that more than 2.6 million anti-Semitic tweets were sent during a 12-month period, including tens of thousands that specifically targeted and threatened a handful of Jewish journalists. Finally, it's impossible to overstate the importance of public figures speaking out strongly against anti-Semitism as well as other forms of bigotry, including racism, xenophobia, and anti-Muslim prejudice. Members of the Senate and others in public life have a unique bully pulpit to elevate these issues and help guide the national conversation. All of us are deeply concerned today about the ongoing harassment of Jews, Muslims, Sikhs, and others who are being targeted because of their religion. And I should point out that Muslims are feeling especially vulnerable because of the rhetoric that was catalyzed during the last campaign that crystallized in the Muslim ban earlier this year. In a recent poll, ADL found that a majority of Americans told us they are concerned about violence against Jews, but an even higher percentage, 76%, said they were concerned about violence against Muslims. Perhaps unsurprisingly, 89% of Muslims Americans indicated the same. So in response to these challenges, we believe what is needed is a mix of approaches. This would include, number one, establishing a federal task force to coordinate hate crime responses across the executive branch. I really applaud Mr. Treen and the Justice Department for creating the Hate Crime Subcommittee within the AG's task force, but we think a federal approach is the next needed and logical step. Number two, helping law enforcement agencies to improve data collection and training about how to handle hate crimes and deal with their victims. Number three, moving forward on legislative strategies, including enacting Senator Blumenthal's No Hate Act, passing an amendment to the Church Arson Prevention Act, which was referenced earlier, securing passage of the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, and strengthening existing hate crime laws. Number four, exploring approaches to address cyber hate, considering new constitutionally sound means for legal redress for victims of cyberbullying, cyber stalking, and doxing, which are not covered under the existing laws. And finally, number five, making sure that calling out bigotry whenever it happens. We really appreciated the President's strong statement when he was here last month, and we were grateful when the Senate unanimously passed a resolution condemning racial, religious, and ethnic hate crimes. So whether it's the U.S. president calling out hate in the country or a university president calling hate on campus, we hope this trend will continue. In sum, the federal government has an essential leadership role to play in confronting hate crimes and alleviating intolerance. Thank you.
Mr. Greenblatt, now Dr. Singh.
My name is Prabhjot Singh. I'm grateful to Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Feinstein, and the entire committee for inviting me here today. I'm a physician and scientist focused on community health. I'm an optimist by nature, but the last months have felt particularly cruel as tragedy has rippled across the Sikh community. Last month, a Sikh cab driver was assaulted and had his turban ripped off in New York City. In March, a Sikh was shot in his driveway outside Seattle by a gunman who told him to go back to his country. Apart from sharing a common humanity and a Sikh identity with these people, we share something else. On September 21st, 2013, I just dropped off my wife, Manmeet Kaur, and my son, Hukum Singh, who was just 1 year old at the time, before walking to a well-lit intersection near Columbia University. As I passed a group of 20 to 30 young men on bicycles, I heard terrorist and Osama from behind me as I felt my beard forcefully pulled. I turned around in time to see that the entire group was mobilizing towards me. The group surrounded me and began punching my face and body. As a physician, I immediately knew that my jaw was fractured because I could feel my teeth moving back and forth. Thankfully, bystanders intervened and prevented an even worse outcome. The next morning, I had surgery to place a stabilizing plate in my mouth, which remained in place for many weeks, even as I returned to work. A few days after being attacked, I wrote an op-ed that shared how deeply grateful I was, and still am, that my wife and son were not with me. Today, they are here with me, and Hukum is now 4 years old. I still think about that evening. My experience received national media attention, and Americans opened their hearts to me. I still have boxes overflowing with prayer cards from churches nationwide. I cherish the letters from Jewish leaders who shared their experience with anti-Semitism. And I still remember the letters from Muslims who shared fears about their children's safety. I experienced the professionalism of NYPD's hate crime unit. I was also interested in whether my experience would become part of the FBI hate crime statistics. We cannot address what we do not know. None of the headlines during that time mentioned that a recent Somali immigrant, a Muslim who wore a hijab, was also attacked by the same group that same evening. The young men threw a bottle of urine at her face, cutting her nose. I know that because she was in the stretcher next to me in the emergency room. When I asked reporters why they didn't mention it, they said it would complicate the story, which was about a professor and a doctor who was mistakenly attacked in his own neighborhood. We cannot accept this premise. There's no such thing as a mistaken hate crime. No one should ever be targeted. The only mistake is thinking otherwise. The other 2 times I was physically attacked after 9/11 did not make the news. In fact, I did not feel comfortable reporting them to anybody but my family and friends. In the aftermath, while finishing my PhD, I struggled with depression, but also found solace in practicing my Sikh faith. Then on August 5th, 2012, a neo-Nazi gunman walked into a Gurdwara in Oak Creek, Wisconsin, and murdered 6 worshipers. Harpreet Singh Saini, who lost his mom at the Gurdwara that day, delivered powerful testimony before a Senate Judiciary Committee shortly thereafter, and I urge all of you to watch it again. These attacks have made me more aware of the broader context of hate in America. It's a breathtaking and frightening landscape that has surged into view into the past months as religious and minority communities have been subjected to threats, arson, assault, and murder. Why are these acts of hate growing? I was horrified to hear our president just this past weekend telling thousands of people at a rally that immigrants are snakes waiting to bite America. Words matter, and when political leaders divide and dehumanize us, it lays the groundwork for hate to infect our society. Senators, I urge you to review the written testimony of the Sikh Coalition and other groups that work on these issues. I wish to close with 2 recommendations. One is that hate crime reporting should be mandatory, not voluntary. We cannot address what we do not know. As a physician, I can attest that mandatory data reporting is crucial when the scope of a challenge is unknown and solutions are urgently needed. Secondly, words matter. Politicians must hold each other accountable for putting their constituents in danger. It seems fashionable these days for politicians to scapegoat immigrants and Muslims, but this endangers all of us. My personal experience with hate violence is a case in point. Please hold each other accountable and make it stop. Senators, I have 2 young sons, and you can see my eldest, Hukum, here today, and with his grandfather, my dad. I worry about both of them. My father, who brought us from Michigan from Kenya, currently lives in Indiana and works for Dow AgroScience. You may be surprised to hear that there's a large population of Sikhs in Indiana. They have recently asked for help to address vandalism against their businesses and violent encounters when they are asked to leave the country. I fear they won't be heard until something tragic happens. My son, Hukum Singh, is about to start kindergarten in the fall. He loves soccer, trains, and Dora the Explorer. Like most Sikh boys, he will wear a putka, a small piece of cloth on his head to cover his long hair. No one on our block treats him differently, and they watch out for him like he was theirs. But according to the Sikh Coalition, a majority of kids like him will be bullied and harassed in school. And as someone who was in his shoes 30 years ago, I know firsthand that I didn't want to talk about physical or verbal assaults with my parents. These are formative years, and how children are treated tells us so much about who we are as a nation and who we aspire to be. One day, I want to talk to him about this hearing and tell him that on this day, a group of senators looked me in the eye and said that hate is a problem in America and that they thought about you as they committed to addressing it openly and honestly. Senators, I'm deeply grateful for this opportunity to share my story with you. Thank you.
Hard to follow that testimony. Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Feinstein, and members of the committee, I am Vanita Gupta, incoming President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the nation's premier civil and human rights coalition of more than 200 national organizations. I'm also the former Acting Assistant Attorney General of the U.S. Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, which, as you know, prosecutes federal hate crimes. Thank you very much for holding this hearing on this very important topic on the rise in religious hate crimes today and for inviting me to testify. And I'm particularly pleased to be here with longstanding partners of the Leadership Conference, ADL, the IACP, and the Sikh Coalition in the work to combat hate violence. This hearing comes at a very crucial time when too many people in our country feel unwelcome and unsafe. And the divisive rhetoric of the recent election and comments and policies that are targeting or casting aspersions on Muslim, immigrant, and other marginalized communities have heightened concerns that the United States is increasingly legitimizing or normalizing hate. It can also very much chill victim reporting. An alarming number of gut-wrenching incidents of hate-motivated violence have shaken the public, including the tragic shooting of 2 South Asian men in Kansas City, Missouri, told to get out of my country, and mosque arsons and synagogue vandalism around the country. It is incumbent upon all of us to reduce hate violence and bias-motivated incidents. Hate crimes are this country's original form of domestic terrorism. And while at the Justice Department, I met with hate crime victims and family members whose loved ones had been slain by hate violence. Hate crimes reverberate, striking fear in individual victims and in their communities. And the Senate's hearing today into the rise of religious-based hate crimes, I think, sends a powerful message that America will not normalize hate and hate-based violence in any form. So thank you. In recent years, and we've talked some about these statistics, there has been a marked increase in hate incidents around the country, particularly against Jews, Muslims, and those perceived to be Muslim. The FBI reported that hate crimes against Muslims rose 14% between 2013 and 2014, and by a staggering 67% between 2014 and 2015. And since January of this year, Muslim Advocates has tracked more than 80 incidents of violence and threats of violence targeting American Muslims and those perceived as Muslims, including the assault of an airport worker wearing a hijab by a traveler in New York. The Anti-Defamation League also reports anti-Semitic incidents in the U.S. have surged by more than 1/3 in 2016 and have jumped 86% in the first quarter of 2017. Since the election, hate crimes overall have spiked. The Southern Poverty Law Center reported 867 bias-related incidents in the 10 days following the presidential election, and that number continues to rise. In response to these disturbing trends, the Leadership Conference recently partnered with 12 organizations to launch Communities Against Hate, a coordinated effort that seeks to raise public awareness and empower local communities and community-based organizations to respond effectively to hate, including wherever possible to report crimes to police and assist in the prosecution through the justice system. When I led the Civil Rights Division, we not only aggressively prosecuted hate crimes and religious-based discrimination, but we also promoted prevention efforts, held interfaith roundtable discussions on religious discrimination and school-based bullying around the country, and conducted trainings with federal, state, and local law enforcement partners in how to recognize, investigate, and prove hate crimes. And these efforts must continue. While my written statement contains many recommendations, I want to just highlight a few that I think bear mentioning today. in closing. First, Congress should make reporting of bias-motivated crimes mandatory. Until that happens, however, the FBI and U.S. attorneys' offices, which are really the face of the Justice Department and local communities, can do more to follow up with the overwhelming number of jurisdictions that either fail to report or report that there are 0 hate crimes at all. Second, Congress should pass legislation to address the gaps in current law to cover threats to religious property. It should also support the No Hate Act. Third, Congress should provide oversight and resources to ensure that the Justice Department continues to aggressively investigate and prosecute hate crimes and conduct robust outreach, prevention, and training efforts with federal, local, and state partners. Fourth, Congress should provide funding for federal anti-bias education and hate crime prevention initiatives. It is not enough to engage in enforcement. We need to be promoting awareness of effective anti-bias education initiatives as well, and those initiatives need funding. And finally, and everyone has spoken to this, and it bears repeating, we urge Congress, the White House, and the entire administration to use the bully pulpit to speak out unequivocally against religious intolerance and bias-motivated crimes in all forms. Our government must do everything in its power to ensure that people in this country live free from physical harm or intimidation that is based on their race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, national origin, or disability status. Thank you both. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak today and for your leadership on this issue, and I look forward to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you very much. Now, Chief Johnson.
Morning, Chairman Grassley, Ranking Member Feinstein, members of the esteemed committee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about an issue of major concern to law enforcement professionals, the increase in religious hate crimes. My name is Will Johnson. I'm the police chief in Arlington, Texas. I'm also a member of the board of directors for the International Association of Chiefs of Police and currently chair the IACP Human and Civil Rights Committee. IACP is the world's largest association of law enforcement leaders with over 28,000 members representing 137 different countries. Today we are focusing solely on religious hate crimes, but hate crimes can also extend to crimes based on somebody's race, national origin, ethnicity, gender identity, disability, or sexual orientation. What makes religious hate crimes so malicious is that their impact spreads far beyond the direct victims and their families. These crimes have far-reaching effects on our communities, spreading fear and toxicity throughout everyone that lives in our community. The IACP has been discussing the challenges and broad impacts of hate crimes for close to 2 decades when we held our first summit on the issue and developed recommendations and a guide for officer response and an investigation to hate crimes. Since that time, we have developed a model policy and accompanying concept and issues paper on the investigation of hate crimes to aid law enforcement agencies. This resource was developed in conjunction with the Anti-Defamation League in September of 2016. I'm happy to be here participating in conjunction with the ADL as they've been a trusted partner, as has Ms. Gupta, and look forward to working with her in her new role and the Sikh Coalition in protecting people's civil rights. Over the years, one of the greatest barriers in confronting and overcoming hate violence on a national, state, and local level has been the lack of firm statistical data on the incidence and nature of these crimes. In short, we have a data problem. I won't restate what has already been stated before the committee today, but clearly we have a hate crime problem in the United States, and the data available does not provide us with sufficient optics on how to best go forward to address it. While more data needs to be reported by law enforcement agencies, we also need our communities to report hate crime incidents. The most recent hate crime victimization publication by BJS shows an estimated 60% of total and violent hate crime victimizations were not reported to police in 2012. Regrettably, we heard in another example in testimony today about hate crimes that weren't reported but yet were endured by the community. The decision of law enforcement officials to classify a crime as a hate crime and the separate act of a local prosecutor to decide whether or not to bring forward hate crime charges can be complicated. It's extremely difficult to determine the intentions of an individual offender, but we must press forward to aggressively pursue all hate crimes
and prosecute them as such. As previously mentioned, the IACP has produced an investigation in hate crimes, model policy, and concepts and issues paper to assist in this process. Additionally, the internet provides extremists with unprecedented ability to spread and recruit followers. Individual racist or racist organizations now have the power to reach a global audience of millions and to communicate among like-minded individuals easily, inexpensively, and oftentimes anonymously. We must find ways to partner at all levels of government to address this issue and to address the issue of self-radicalization that can come from these types of outreaches. Obviously, hate speech is offensive and hurtful. The First Amendment usually protects many forms of expression. However, there is a growing trend on the internet to intimidate people, and we must fight against this because regardless of the mode of delivery, hate speech containing criminal threats is never acceptable, nor is it protected under the First Amendment. As I come before you today, I'd like to bring forward a few instances in which we feel that you can directly assist local law enforcement in addressing these issues. First and foremost, we need more programs and funding for officer training and education. Clearly, we have a responsibility as a profession to make sure that we are doing the best job possible of capturing incidents of hate crime so that they can be successfully introduced into the judicial process for successful prosecution. Next, we need expanded programs and funding enhancing community police relations. Only through effective community police relations can we address this hate, the underreporting of hate instances, and the restorative justice that must following each of these instances. Finally, it's been spoken about what can be done to enhance mandatory reporting on the reporting of hate crimes in the United States. Specialized task force and units focusing on hate crimes and enhanced victim services for those that are the recipients of these heinous crimes. The IACP is pleased with the Attorney General's commitment to address hate crimes through the creation of the Justice Department Hate Crimes Subcommittee as part of the Attorney General's Task Force on Crime Reduction and Public Safety. As a membership organization, we look forward to participating in that process, but we would urge that this must ultimately produce action and not just a discussion on this point so that we can serve our members of our communities. Finally, we would echo the statements about all elected officials and those in power using the bully pulpit to bring this issue to the forefront of public discussion. All elected officials need to condemn acts of bigotry every chance that they can. As elected officials, you hold an important role, and as a nation and in your communities want to hear you speak out against these issues. I implore you to use your role to speak out against hate crimes and assist your local law enforcement in helping to successfully address these issues. In conclusion, religious freedom is the bedrock of our democratic republic and a constitutional right that we must protect at all costs. A fundamental aspect of protecting religious freedom is to protect those that are worshiping from hate crimes and to protect our citizens, and the protection of our citizens should be a universally shared goal by all persons in society. On behalf of the IACP, I conclude by thanking you again for the opportunity to testify on this most important topic, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Dr. Singh, it's probably not enough for us to say that we're sorry for the crime you had to endure and the suffering that came from it, but I don't think we'd be very human if we didn't recognize that that's what you face, but we do appreciate your telling us your story. One of the parts of the crime committed against you that struck me was how the mob humiliated you before the assault. Apart from your serious physical injuries, can you tell us about any lasting emotional or psychological trauma faced by religious hate crime victims? And if that describes you, tell us about your point of view on that as well.
Thank you, Chairman Grassley, and thank you for your kind remarks. I appreciate it. On a personal basis, given that the attack in 2013 was the third time I was attacked since 9/11, the first two times I struggled considerably from an emotional perspective while I was trying to go through training as a physician, as a scientist through the National Institutes of Health's training programs. I made it through, but it was a significant challenge. How one deals with the aftermath is a question of working with family and otherwise, and I think what would have been very helpful at that juncture, and what I've heard from our community and others, is that improving trauma-informed engagement with hate crime victims is very important. I know that from our local law enforcement perspective, I saw two very different sides of the coin: an incredibly professional NYPD hate crime unit that knew how to interact with me, that had the resources and the background to, at least in that very moment, help me really move forward from that incident. And I actually really have enjoyed working and learning from our local precinct, but they weren't prepared to interact with a hate crime victim at that juncture. So I think it starts with the right resourcing at the outset, because the effects are lasting and considerable. I know that for myself, I've had an incredible amount of support from my community. It's a real source of support. But I do know that most of the people that have reached out to me by email, in my inbox, that I hear regularly, are struggling, are alone, and don't know what to do in the aftermath. I think it's a significant area of work, and mental health as it relates to hate crimes is something that I hope that we will learn more about from my colleagues at the ADL and from other civil rights groups.
For Chief Johnson, you've heard my colleagues and some people on the panel bring up the issue that crime statistics aren't very accurate, and we need we've had some recommendations for mandatory reporting. And of course, there are problems with agencies failing to report at all or failing to report accurately, with so many saying they have never encountered such crimes. But I'm skeptical that there is an easy legislative answer to this problem. We often see news reports of crimes that were obviously hate crimes, but the reports often indicate that law enforcement only considers them to be potential hate crimes. And correct me on any of this stuff if you think I've got it wrong. There seems to be a real reluctance for law enforcement to call religious hate crimes what they are, religious hate crimes. If law enforcement's unwilling to call a crime a hate crime, I don't see how changing the law to require reporting of hate crimes will change the current situation of spotty data and missed opportunities. So this is my question. What do you think explains the reluctance of law enforcement to classify a crime as a religious hate crime? Is there any way to get around the problem, if you see it as I see it? And if you don't, that's okay too.
Senator, I appreciate the question, and I would agree that there are opportunities within our profession to always do better. I believe that there is an opportunity through focused training to better equip and educate our workforce where they can recognize and understand hate crimes so that they are effectively and adequately reported. I also would like to provide an example to the committee, if I can, about a challenge beyond just the individual reporting of the hate crime by the responding officer. And one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this topic. As I was a young patrol officer, approximately 22 years of age, I responded to a woman, a middle-aged African-American female, who was buying groceries, and when she came out of the grocery store, somebody had carved a racial epithet into the side of her minivan. I remember how wholly inadequate I felt like my response was at that time, because there was nothing that I could do to help restore what this woman had gone through. And I also remember the fact that it was clear to me that this was not the first time she'd experienced a hate crime. But had somebody expressed that hatred without carving a racial epithet into the side of her car and only damaged her car, it would have been impossible for the responding officer to know that it was hate motivated that suspect from committing that act. And that truly is the problem and the challenge that law enforcement has, is oftentimes, unless the offender is explicit in their motivation in why they committed the crime, we might believe or have a hunch that it was a hate-based crime, but no effective way for us to report it definitively in our reporting process. And so we have to have a balanced approach in what we do, enhanced officer training, but also the recognition that this is not an easily solved problem.
Okay, Senator Feinstein.
Let me say thank you to the four of you. I think each one of you gave very different presentations, but extraordinarily meaningful. I do think that leaders have to stand up, and I think that police leaders have to stand up too. And so, Chief, you've made 3 recommendations. You've said make hate crime reporting mandatory. I agree, we should. Secondly, programs and training. And then thirdly, expanded effective police-community relations. I would like to make a suggestion to you that you go to the Chiefs Association. I understand you have a new chief, DeLuca from Florida, and I have found the chiefs very effective on the Hill and suggest that they take up this. I am willing to draft legislation, and I'll go to my chairman and say, will you work with me on it to do all of the 3? But there's this vulgar expression, the fish rots from the head. And I think the head of our government has to be more understanding that you cannot divide people. We have to work to bring people together, that's a very big part of a leadership agenda. So what I'm asking of you is if you will involve the Chiefs Association in the 3 points that you made in terms of recommendations. I know that Senator Hirono will likely assist with this. I hope Senator Grassley will and other members of this committee. I think we can bring about a new day of awareness, but I think particularly with the cyberbullying and doing this over the internet, I have firsthand information on what it does to young people. And it's terrible what it does. The suicides, the cuttings of themselves, the kind of emasculation they feel. And I think there is a role for us to establish some prohibitions. So I would like to work with the Chiefs Association, and I hope you would take that message back. Will you?
Thank you, Senator. The IACP is absolutely...
I'm sorry, could you raise that mic?
Yes, ma'am. We're absolutely prepared to make sure that all persons are provided equal protection under the law. And that's really what we're speaking of on this issue. As it relates to mandatory hate crime reporting, certainly I think that the recording of all hate crime to understand what issues were faced would be helpful. I also know that if mandatory reporting was the only element that was passed in this larger discussion, it would be ineffective. And so it really is going to take all of the pillars of the arguments that have been expressed at the table today to be able to have a stronger, more robust response as a community, including law enforcement, to address this issue, and we're prepared to work to that end.
I think that's a bingo moment. Thank you. Ms. Gupta, I know of your good work in the past, and well, you're welcome back here anytime. Would you provide leadership in your organization to help with this effort?
Of course, the issue of fighting hate and bias-motivated violence has been a long-standing priority for the Leadership Conference, and it continues to be, obviously, in these times. And I do want to underscore that while every witness that I've heard, and indeed many senators have spoken of the importance of officials using their bully pulpit, that it's not just about words, but it's also about policies that that can target and make communities, some of the most vulnerable communities in our midst that are most vulnerable to hate crimes, feel like they can't trust the government, that the government doesn't protect them, or that it can have a chilling effect on victims. And so it's words and it's policies.
Thank you. Mr. Greenblatt, would you lead the ADL to provide some help if we try and put together a legislative agenda? And this assumes that we're going to stand on the bully pulpit.
That's right.
And advocate for it.
So, yes, Madam Senator, the ADL would be gratified to play a role and collaborate with you. What I might do is, you had asked in the first session about the numbers, and I can tell you we have a little over 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States. About 1,800 actively report on hate crimes, which means over 13,000 do not report zero hate crimes in their localities. That's over 13,000. And then about 3,400 population centers, communities, don't report at all. There were 87 communities with over 100,000, populations over 100,000, that also did not report at all. Now, the ADL trains law enforcement. We've done great work with the police chiefs, as was noted earlier. We train about 15,000 officers every year. This is a big part of our focus because, as you've pointed out, it is indeed so important. And I think, to build upon what Ms. Gupta said, indeed, words and actions, and knowing that data drives policy, there are policies that you could explore in the legislation. I pointed out in my testimony, but I'll just highlight a couple quick bullets for you. Number one, the Department of Justice, from the Attorney General on down, should promote hate crime reporting, and the FBI offices should encourage this as well in their jurisdictions. Number two, you could rate and score police departments and consider them for federal funding on the basis of do they report hate crimes? Do they track them? You also could think about performance audits for FBI offices based on compliance with the Hate Crimes Statistics Act. And there are some programs. The FBI has a terrific program called the National Incident Reporting System that could use more money to facilitate the ability of the FBI to track these more effectively. So there could be both carrots and sticks that you could use to ensure compliance and performance in this area.
Dr. Singh, would you be willing to participate in an effort to put a policy instruction together, which we might turn into law?
Thank you, Senator. Absolutely, and I would also count on the support of my colleagues here and the SICK Coalition in doing so. Thank you.
I think that would be excellent. And Mr. Chairman, I think just the gross numbers are so extraordinary that I really believe we have to take some action. And it's fortuitous, but the four people here really represent varying aspects of our society, which can be very important in the solution. So if we can put something together that we can take your thoughts, and particularly mandatory reporting, I mean, that ought to happen, and we can certainly do that. But the rest of the program, to really develop a policy directive that can be used on the local and the state level, as well as on our level, would really be helpful. And those institutions that could help with this would be very welcome. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Hirono and then Senator Coons, while you two are asking questions, I'm going to step in the anteroom to be briefed on another subject, and then I'll come back and close the meeting down.
Good.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of the panelists for your testimony, very enlightening. And I was particularly taken with your testimony, Dr. Singh. I think education is so important, and what happens in our school system, as you indicated, Dr. Singh, you have major concerns about what kind of experiences your son will have. And so one of the things that I think should happen is that every school should have some kind of policy on how they deal with bullying, to identify bullying, and maybe the subset of bullying that is bias-based or hate-based. Would you agree that that would be a step toward addressing some of the underlying problems with the expression of bias in our country.
Thank you, Senator. I would strongly agree that would be important. And I would also add that especially that formative stage when children are going through elementary school, they're curious about the world, they'd like to know about the people around them. It's the perfect time to make sure that we give them the opportunity to engage with that broader set of education that they need about it. But I would agree on a policy perspective, that sounds very practical and important.
And yet, at the national level and in all our schools, and this is something that perhaps Ms. Gupta can address, because you did say that one of the recommendations you would make would be funding educational programs to prevent the learning of bias and racism. So not every state requires schools to have this kind of anti-bullying policies and actions that can be taken. Is there something we can do at the federal level to address the bullying in our schools problem?
Yeah, I think it's really important that there be funding for evaluated effective programs for schools and youth violence prevention, and that the federal government can make available information as well to the public about effective interventions around anti-bias training and hate crime prevention programs. This is a cultural issue as much as we can talk about enforcement. We've got to be focusing on prevention as well, and starting in the schools where children can be the most vulnerable, but as Dr. Singh so ably said, really exposes children to understanding and tolerance. Those values are fundamental. I also, just because the groups, a lot of nonprofits, including the Sikh Coalition and ADL and others, have been so concerned about the current spate in hate crimes. It's very important that we have been working together on a Communities Against Hate initiative to also do public education in the interim, to be able to put out messages that are focused on preventing hate crimes, changing the culture around hate, working with students, connecting victims of hate crimes who report to our hotline to fill the void right now, but certainly funding educational programs to help do that culture change is vitally important.
Clearly, there are a number of steps that we need to be taken. It's not consecutive, but there are a lot of collaboration that needs to occur if we really want to get to the bottom of this, because racism in our country is never far below the surface. That is my view, and as a minority person myself, I can certainly relate to how it feels to be targeted. And every time our country targets a minority group for discriminatory treatment, we are deemed, the history shows that we have been very, very wrong. And right now, it's the Jewish community, it's the Muslim community. This doesn't stop in our country, and so I think that this is an opportunity for us to support those kinds of programs that evidence shows works. So there are a lot of fronts that we can go in. And in fact, I was really shocked that there's cyberbullying going on, and that's another area that I'm glad that all of you have said that you would work with our committee, and Senator Feinstein asked this question to come up with appropriate legislation to address these issues. But cyberbullying, 2.6 million tweets, anti-Semitic tweets.
Yep.
And sometimes these tweets lead to overt actions that are very dangerous.
They certainly do, Madam Senator. The ADL just opened up an office in Silicon Valley specifically to focus on the increasing threat of online abuse, cyberbullying, cyberstalking, swatting, doxing. This is all really beginning to crest. And at the current time, we lack adequate policy mechanisms to deal with these challenges. We engage very directly with industry. On a daily basis, my office is working with Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, Twitter, eBay to identify and deal with specific incidences. But I could give you a long list of where we see these online activities actually spill off into the real world.
Yes.
So we've seen journalists who have been identified and targeted on Twitter and then attacked really mercilessly,
yes,
with people stalking their homes, people sending threatening letters, people doing things to undermine their professional lives. We've seen it happen to journalists over the campaign. We recently saw a situation in Whitefish, Montana that was really quite horrible, where the Jewish community leaders were threatened by the quote-unquote alt-right white supremacists. So it is a big problem, as you're pointing out. And we would be very delighted to work with you to explore legislation to deal with the issue.
Thank you. And just a note to Chief Johnson, thank you very much for the kind of enlightened thinking that you brought to this committee. Mahalo.
Thank you, Senator. Before recognizing Senator Coons, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to place the following statements in the record. Bend the Arc Jewish Action, Muslim Public Affairs Council, the Sikh Coalition, and a letter from members of the Senate to the President of the United States. Senator Coons.
Thank you, Senator Feinstein. I'd like to thank our terrific panel for your service and leadership and your testimony here today. Dr. Singh, your individual testimony about both your experiences and your advocacy and work was deeply compelling. Chief, thank you for what you're doing in the leadership of your department and elsewhere. And Ms. Gupta and Mr. Greenblatt, both in your current roles and in previous roles, you've been terrific and effective voices against hate and hate crimes. Let me see if I can get one question in to each of you in the brief amount of time that I have. As I said in my previous round of questioning, Delaware saw, as did so many other states, bomb threats against our Jewish Community Center back in February and in March. I was encouraged that a broad range of Delawareans rallied at the JCC to stand up to such hate and to such threats and terrorism. And similarly, when there were threats and inappropriate statements about Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim earlier in the year. Mr. Greenblatt, if I might, you've talked about pushing back against the scourge of online hate. And I was encouraged by your answers about that. I'm also concerned about threats that really target houses of worship.
Yes.
We've seen mosques targeted by arsonists and JCCs receiving bomb threats. What more should the government do? What more should this committee do to ensure that federal resources are available to support institutions that are seeing significant threats to their security?
Well, we certainly think first it starts with making sure that local law enforcement is adequately trained to provide support for houses of worship and other faith-based centers, be they JCCs or Islamic centers, et cetera. It's critical that local law enforcement appreciate the complexity and the sensitivity of ensuring that the congregants in these houses of worship have adequate protection. Secondly, I think speaking up at the local level really matters as well. So as I heard about the stories of what happened in Delaware, because we were tracking these JCCs, the fact that local elected officials stood up and spoke out in defense of the Jewish Community Center, I think was really vital in sending a signal. I know there's been some debate about and some consideration of additional funds to harden the institutions themselves. We certainly appreciate that some would want additional resources. We have some concern about that because of the fungibility of funds, the difficulty of tracking such dollars, the competition that can ensue at the local level, and really muddying the church-state divide. But we think investing in our law enforcement agencies to ensure they can provide adequate training and support for local faith-based communities is an appropriate response.
Thank you, Mr. Greenblatt. Chief Johnson, if I might, what training and tools are currently available to make sure that we're able to train and support local law enforcement in understanding how to appropriately respond to threats against houses of worship, and to make sure that we're moving forward with bias-free policing? In my view, having well-trained and well-supported local law enforcement and having them in particular trained in how to respond to threats against houses of worship and trained in how to respond to hate crimes and how to conduct bias-free policing makes it more likely that we will have more thorough reporting, more timely and appropriate investigation, and thus more effective prosecution. What's your view, Chief?
Yes, sir. Thank you for the question. I would agree that there are a variety of different avenues in which we can focus our training. Much of the testimony today spoke about the partnership with the different agencies that are represented at the panel and how we've collaboratively worked on this topic, particularly with the model policy for IACP with ADL to make sure that the initial response and then post-investigation is thorough and achieves the shared goal. I'd also take an opportunity to celebrate the funding and resources that comes through the Department of Justice COPS office that helps us to provide focused and dedicated training materials and support for topics that are supportive of this, inclusive of procedural justice, bias-based policing, policing in minority and disenfranchised communities, and also addressing hate crimes. But I would close with what I would argue is our highest need. Law enforcement is facing unprecedented challenges in terms of a variety of different topics, hate crimes being one, elevated violent crimes, the ability for bond and grand juries and prosecution and mental health, and all of these different things touching law enforcement, which is bringing us in different directions. We need to pass the National Crime Commission and be able to have a holistic review of all of these different threats and issues confronting our communities and be able to address it systematically from all different aspects, not just from a law enforcement perspective.
I agree with you, Chief, and I appreciate your speaking up about the need for a law enforcement commission. I also, frankly think we should sustain the COPS program and sustain investments that make it possible for state and local law enforcement from the academy through the whole career of service of law enforcement officers to get the sort of training and research and engagement with ADL and with other organizations that have terrific curriculum materials. My last question, Ms. Gupta, these issues really shouldn't be partisan. And you heard earlier that 100 senators joined in sending a letter to the Attorney General urging a prompt response, effective response to the JCC bombing threats earlier this year. Are there Civil Rights Division initiatives that you hope to see continued that would be effective in combating hate crimes and promoting inclusiveness during this administration?
Yes, thank you, Senator. There was, as I've said before, enforcement, obviously, and robust enforcement of our hate crimes laws is vital, but it is woefully insufficient to address and meet the needs right now. It's really incumbent on the Justice Department to continue very aggressive outreach with particularly vulnerable communities. When I was the head of the Civil Rights Division, we went to all corners of the country to have interfaith conversations, to talk about the relationship between school bullying and hate crimes and understand what some local solutions are and what local communities are doing. We invested in training, federal, state, local law enforcement training. The Justice Department made that a priority, and I will say there was not a single local law enforcement agency that was not starved for specific training, and they were terrific partners with the FBI, with U.S. attorneys' offices in specific hate crimes, identification, proof, how you build trust. Those kinds of trainings, I think, are vitally important. They were also with community-based organizations. And this I just want to close with. It is really important, of course, that in order to have any effective enforcement, both for local law enforcement and for the Justice Department, there needs to be trust between the most vulnerable communities and these very important institutions. And so the ongoing work of ensuring trust, that victims don't feel that they are chilled in reporting or that they don't trust police, who are often the face of government in their communities, or the government itself, is vitally important. So that ongoing work, that is a broader thing than just the hate crimes piece, there needs to be an ongoing investment in the kinds of programs that the Justice Department engages in to rebuild trust where it has been vitally eroded, but also to recognize that words and policies that come out of any government entity carry and can have their own impact on the ability for law enforcement to be able to address and prevent crime. And so it is a multifaceted effort. The prevention efforts out of the Justice Department are vitally important, and my hope is that they will continue very robustly.
Well, thank you, Ms. Gupta. I look forward to working with you in your new role at LCCR. I look forward to continuing to work with the IACP, and particularly want to thank the Anti-Defamation League. Your resources and materials have been very helpful in Delaware, as our local law enforcement has done improved training to be more conscious of these issues, and as we step up to try and advocate for and defend our Sikh community, our Muslim community, our Jewish community, everybody in our state who has need of the protection of law enforcement to be able to worship freely and as our First Amendment protects. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Blumenthal.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing together this really excellent panel on a supremely and profoundly important topic. I want to thank Mr. Greenblatt and Ms. Gupta for endorsing the No Hate Bill. And thank each of you and the other members of the panel for your really hands-on work. I want to say how grateful I am to the ADL for its educational work in Connecticut. Apart from working with our law enforcement as you do, the work that you do in our schools and our communities is so profoundly important in raising awareness and education. And I want to say also how grateful I am for the amicus curiae briefs that you filed in the litigation against the President's executive order on the travel ban and refugees, citing periods in our history, this nation's history, the greatest nation in the history of the world, where we have turned away refugees in the past. The St. Louis in 1939, the Chinese exclusion in the 1800s, and of course the internment of the Japanese during World War II, shameful periods in our history where, in effect, the nation succumbed to hatred and demonstrated the importance of proactive and positive leadership at the national level. I hope that we will see such leadership. In my view, we have yet to see it, and I hope that we will see it in the future. I want to ask Ms. Gupta, could you talk to us a little bit about why you think there are relatively few prosecutions? I know the answer as a state attorney general and former federal prosecutor, but perhaps you could tell us about the difficulty of investigating and prosecuting these crimes and why it's so important to have leaders at the local level like Chief Johnson on your side.
It is, thank you for that question, Senator. It is absolutely vital to have leaders like Chief Johnson and the IACP that has been working on not only effective hate crimes response, but also on rebuilding police community trust in communities all over the country, which, as I said, is a vitally important thing. Nobody in law enforcement or at the Justice Department, from my experience, can do much about any hate crime if communities don't feel safe in reporting them. And we know that not only we've talked a lot about data and the data problem, and pointed to kind of what we can do about local police departments reporting, but the fact of the matter is also that individuals in these vulnerable communities need to feel safe in reporting, and we know that there is vast underreporting. It is why it's very important for law enforcement to also have trust with community-based organizations in their local communities, because often these organizations are the front lines for hearing about incidents of violence from victims who may be too afraid to report or don't trust the police or don't trust the government. And so being able to have that is vitally important. I also think it's why it's critically important to have training in all parts of the country with law enforcement, with the FBI, kind of state, local law enforcement, and with community-based organizations of the kind that we had been doing in prior years, so that we can build trust, but also so that communities and law enforcement are aware of what kind of information is necessary to be able to prosecute these cases. These are difficult cases, and there are some high standards of proof that have been established through the courts, and therefore having this kind of flow of information is vitally important.
As you have probably read and perhaps seen from your own experience in this area, the fears that have been so widespread as a result of the administration's expanded apprehension policies relating to immigration, the kinds of panic in some cases that have caused women, victims of domestic violence, to decline to come forward simply because they feared deportation. I'm wondering whether that kinds of fear also can deter members of other communities, immigrants who are here illegally, who may be victims of hate crime, from coming forward and participating in the criminal justice system.
Senator, thank you for raising that. It is, I think, a very real thing. I think it has always been real, but it is very real right now. And it isn't just that people who are undocumented may be feeling fear. It affects people, all immigrants and people of color, from feeling comfortable in certain circumstances, from trusting law enforcement, and that hurts law enforcement. But I think it's most important not to hear it necessarily from me, but actually to hear it from the police chiefs around the country that very much understand just how important it is that their ability to solve crime and to have the trust of victims not be impeded through kind of politicized policy making that is going to hurt their very core public safety mission that, affects all law enforcement activity up and down the chain.
I have talked to members of the Muslim community, for example, in Connecticut, who've told me Often they know of victims, including their children, who are bullied at school, or others who are victims of harassment based on their ethnic or racial or religious status, and are very reluctant to come forward because they feel they may encounter immigration authorities, and sometimes without any real basis. As you say, the apprehension may be simply that they're here and they are immigrants, and therefore they're reluctant to come forward. And I would encourage others, if you have answers to this question or comments or observations.
I can tell you from the ADL perspective, Mr. Senator, that we certainly hear about this. We certainly hear about legal immigrants who are simply concerned with interacting with law enforcement because of prior experiences in their home countries, for example, where any engagement with governmental authorities resulted in interrogation, imprisonment, or worse. Now, there might not be a basis for their concerns here, but it inhibits their desire to work with law enforcement or other authorities. I'd also just like to say, as the grandson of a Holocaust survivor who fled the horrors of Nazi Germany and went to Bridgeport, Connecticut, and where I was also sort of raised, your comments about our position on the immigrants have particular personal resonance for me. I think it's incumbent upon all of us as public figures, whether we hold elected office or whether we're involved in organizations like all of us or simply prominent members of our community, to speak up and stand up for the other, because we were once strangers and we remember what it means to be denigrated.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you all for participating. A very worthwhile meeting we've had, and a very worthwhile panel. Meeting adjourned.
And then I wanted to remove committee. Let's do this. That way, because I also want to continue to come to the ICD conferences.
Here's a